The frost had not yet lifted from the long gravel drive. When the dogs began to bark at a man none of them remembered. And Rosamond, standing at the cold window of the morning room, with the household ledger open and a child's shoe in her other hand, watched a stranger in a faded officer's coat dismount at the gate of a house that the whole county believed belonged, in some quiet legal sense, to her. He did not come up the drive at once. He stood at the iron gate with one gloved hand upon the latch, and looked at the grey stone face of Wexcombe Hall as a man looks at a grave he has not been permitted to dig. The wind moved the bare limes along the avenue. Somewhere above her in the nursery a small voice was singing a song with no proper tune, and Rosamond felt the whole careful architecture of the last 2 years tremble at its foundation, because she knew with the certainty of a woman who has lived too long on borrowed ground that this man had not come to call. He had come home. She set the shoe down upon the ledger. She did not run. A woman in her position learned early that running announced guilt, and she had never permitted herself the luxury of guilt, only the colder discipline of survival. Below her the front door opened. She heard old Hester's voice, thinned by 60 winters, rise in a question, and then fall into a silence that was worse than any cry. Footsteps crossed the flagged hall. Rosamond pressed her palm flat against a windowsill to steady the betrayal of her own pulse, which had begun to knock at the base of her throat like a thing wanting out. The man who appeared in the doorway of the morning room was perhaps 32, lean past the point of health, with a soldier's stillness, and a face that had been handsome before something had been burned out of it. There was a scar through his left brow, a pale seam that pulled the eye, and his gaze, when it found her, was the gray of slate under rain. For a long moment he simply looked at her, at the child's shoe, at the open ledger with her own neat figures running down the page, and Rosamond understood that he was reading the rooms of his house the way she had once read deserted villages on the retreat to the coast, counting what had been taken. "You are not," he said at last, his voice low and level, "my wife." She might have wept. She might have begged. Instead, Rosamond lifted her chin and answered him with the only thing she had left, which was the truth. And the truth was this, that he was correct, that she had never claimed to be his wife in her own hearing, and that the lie which had sheltered her and the boy had been built by hands far more powerful than her own. To understand how a man came home from the wars to find a stranger and a child installed in his manor as his widow and his heir, one must go back to a colder morning, 2 years before, to a different doorway and a different woman. Rosamond had come to Wexcombe in the autumn after the harvest failed, a soldier's relict herself, the widow of a quartermaster's clerk named Vale, who had died of fever in a Portuguese hospital, and left her nothing but his name and a son not yet weaned. She had walked the last 6 miles of the journey because the carrier would take her no farther without coin she did not have, and she had arrived at the servant's door with the child wrapped inside her own thin mantle and her shoes worn through at the heel. She had asked for work. She had been prepared to scrub, to mend, to carry coal. She had not been prepared for the woman who ruled the house. The dowager Lady Sabine was a handsome woman of 60, with white hair dressed high, and a back that had never once been seen to bend, and she had looked down at the half-frozen widow on her threshold, the way a clever woman looks at a tool that has arrived unbidden but exactly on time. The master of the house, her nephew, had gone to the peninsula, and then to the Low Countries, and had not written in 11 months. The lawyers had begun to use a particular word in their letters, a soft and terrible word, presumed, and behind that word stood another man, the dowager's other nephew, who wanted Wexcombe and its 4,000 a year, and would have it the moment the law agreed that the soldier was dead and had left no son. "You have a boy," Lady Sabine had said, not as a question. "How old?" "He is nearing a year, my lady." "And his father?" "Dead, my lady, at Badajoz." The old woman had been silent then for a long while, and Rosamond, who had learned to read the faces of the powerful as a sailor reads the sky, had seen a plan assemble itself behind the pale eyes. She had been brought inside. She had been fed, and within the week she had been told, in a dry and pitiless voice, exactly what she was to become. The dowager wanted an heir. Not a true one, for the true heir was on a battlefield and very likely under it, but an heir of convenience, a small body to stand between Wexcombe and the grasping cousin she despised more than she feared the truth. She would put it about the county that her lost nephew had married quietly before he sailed, a girl of no family, and that the marriage had given him a son. The girl would be Rosamond. The son would be the boy Tobias. And the proof would be a parish register in a distant county, where the vicar owed the dowager a living, and a marriage line in an ink only a year old, and a household trained to silence by wages and by fear. "I'm asking you," the dowager had said, "to be a lie that keeps a child fed. Yours and the estates refuse, and you may take your boy back to the road." Rosamond had not refused. Let the comfortable judge her who have never stood at a gate in worn shoes, with a hungry child against their ribs. She had told herself that first winter that she harmed no one, that the soldier was dead and beyond all injury, that she was merely the warm body filling a chair no living man would ever claim. She had told herself that for 2 years. She had almost come to believe it, and now the dead man stood in her morning room with rain-gray eyes and asked her who she was, and every comfortable lie she had built fell down at once like a house of cut paper. His name, she would learn within the hour, was Alaric, and he was the Earl of Penhallow, master of Wexcombe Hall, returned from the field at Waterloo, where a French ball had broken his shoulder and a fever had nearly finished what the ball began. He had lain 8 months in a Belgian farmhouse with no use of his writing hand, attended by a surgeon who did not expect him to live, and he had come home the moment he could sit a horse ahead of any letter to a house that had buried him and replaced him while he breathed. That first day passed in a strange and terrible courtesy. He did not throw her into the road, though the law and his right both would have let him. He sat in the great chair by the cold hearth, with his broken shoulder held stiffly, and he questioned her, and Rosamond answered him with a plainness that surprised them both. She told him of the road and the worn shoes and the fever at Badajoz. She told him of the dowager's bargain. She did not weep, and she did not plead, and somewhere in the long gray afternoon she saw something shift in his ruined face, some recalculation, as though he had braced himself to find a grasping adventuress, and had found instead a tired woman telling him the truth against her own interest.
"Where is my aunt?" he said. "Gone to the dower house at Michaelmas, my lord. She keeps to her rooms. She is not well."
"And the boy?" Rosamond's hands tightened in her lap.
"Asleep," she said. "He is 2 years old. He has done nothing."
"Whatever you do with me, my lord, I ask only that you remember. He was told nothing and chose nothing." The Earl looked at her for a long moment, and the scar through his brow pulled tight, and he said, "Only, I do not make war on children," and rose and went stiffly up the stairs of his own house to a room he had not slept in for 3 years, and Rosamond sat alone in the dark, and did not sleep at all. She did not yet know that her arrival had not been the dowager's only stroke, nor the cleverest. She did not yet know that the cousin who wanted Wexcombe had not been idle in the years of waiting, and that the lie which sheltered her had a second author, whose interest was the precise opposite of her own. You may feel, as she did not yet feel, the floor beginning to tilt. The cousin was a Mr. Argar. Crispin Ferrars, a smooth, well-tailored man of 40, with soft hands and a barrister's memory, and he had a sister, Miss Drusilla Ferrars, a beauty of the colder sort, who had been raised from the cradle to be the mistress of a great house, and had selected Wexcombe for the office. For 3 years the Ferrars had built their case against the absent Earl, with patience and with money. They had found witnesses who would swear the soldier had died at Quatre Bras. They had retained an antiquary to question the suspiciously recent ink of the marriage register, and they had done all this for a simple reason that Rosamond grasped only slowly, that the dowager's false heir did not protect Wexcombe from the Ferrars, but enraged them. A child, even a false one, stood between Crispin and the estate, and Mr. Ferrars did not intend to be stood between. He came to Wexcombe on the 3rd day after the Earl's return, in a fine carriage with his sister beside him, and he came smiling, because a clever man smiles widest when his ground is shifted under him. To the county, Rosamond had been for 2 years a kind of marvel and a kind of scandal. She had heard the word in the village, and across the pews, and once from the lips of a footman who did not know she stood behind the screen. To the county she was the upstart, the soldier's widow, who had bought a coronet with a borrowed child and a forged line, and they had decided what she was long before they had spoken to her. She wore the word as she wore her plain grey gowns without complaint, because complaint would only have confirmed it. Mr. Ferrars said the word to her face that third afternoon, in the long gallery with his sister at his elbow, and a smile fixed upon his soft mouth. "So this is the upstart," he said, as though Rosamond were a piece of furniture he had been told to admire. "The kitchen-bred widow, who would teach us all to call her ladyship." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He named her in front of the Earl and 2 servants and his sister, and he watched the Earl's face to see what the soldier would do, and the Earl did nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. And Rosamond felt the cold of it down to the worn heels of her shoes. What she did not yet see, what no one in the gallery saw, was the way the Earl's broken hand had closed slowly upon the head of his cane, until the knuckles whitened, and then, with great discipline, opened again. The days that followed were a campaign, though it took Rosamond some time to understand that she was the disputed ground over which it would be fought. Mr. Ferrars did not return to the city. He took rooms at the inn in the village, and he began, with lawyer's patience, to dismantle her. He sent his antiquary to the parish where the false register lay, and procured a sworn statement that the marriage ink was less than 2 years old. He found the carrier, who had carried a destitute widow as far as the crossroads and no farther, and he had the man swear to her poverty and her solitude on the date she was supposed to have been a wedded countess in another county. He built, stone by patient stone, a case that would not merely turn Rosamond out of doors, but would see her taken up for fraud, and the child declared no kin of Wexcombe, and the estate delivered into his own soft hands. He guarded each proof. He kept the antiquary's statement under his own seal at the inn. He paid the carrier to leave the county, so no second voice could reach him. He was not a careless man, and he did not leave his evidence lying about for a kitchen girl to find. And the Earl, through all of it, said nothing, and did nothing. The dinners they were now obliged to share for the look of the thing were long and nearly wordless, the 2 of them seated at the far ends of a table that could have sat 20, a branch of candles burning down between them and old Hester moving the dishes in and out without a sound. Rosamond would watch him cut his meat slowly with his good hand, the broken shoulder held against the chair back, and she would ask after the tenants because it was safe ground, and he would answer in 3 words, and then the silence would close again like water over a stone. She mistook his stillness for indifference, for she had not yet learned what a soldier's stillness conceals. He watched. That was what he did. He had spent 3 years learning to read terrain that wished to kill him, to mark the dry ground and the boggy, the cover and the trap, and he turned that same cold attention now upon his own house and the people moving through it. He saw that Rosamond rose before the servants and went over the accounts herself, and that the figures were honest to the farthing. He saw that she had reduced the household spending in the lean year, and made up the deficit out of the small widow's pension that was all she truly owned, so that not one tenant had gone hungry, while the master was thought dead. He saw the way the boy ran to her, and not to the nurse, and the way she stopped at the foot of the nursery stairs each night, with her hand on the rail and her head bowed, gathering herself, before she went up to him. He saw, in short, that the woman the county called an upstart had governed his estate better in 2 years of fraud than his own blood had governed it in honesty, and the seeing of it troubled him in a place he had thought the war had cauterized shut. One evening in the 2nd week, a hard rain came down out of the hills, and a tenant's barn caught a chimney spark and began to burn. A boy ran up the avenue from the lower farm with the rain streaming off him, and beat upon the kitchen door, and the cry went through the house that Coomb's barn was alight, with the milch cows still inside. Rosamond did not wait for the men. She caught up a lantern from the passage, and a horse blanket from the bench by the scullery door, and she was across the wet fields in her grey gown before the Earl had got his coat, her shoes filling with the cold mud of the low pasture. the orange of the fire growing in the dark ahead of her with every stride. When he came up through the smoke, he found her already in the line, passing buckets from the horse pond, her sleeves soaked to the shoulder, her hair come down and plastered to her cheek, directing the saving of the beasts in a clear, low voice that the frightened men obeyed without question, because she had never once in 2 years given them a foolish order. "Bring the heifers through the north gap," she was saying. "Hood their eyes with the sacking. They will not pass the flame else. They saved the barn. They saved every animal in it. The last cow let out wild-eyed under a wet sack, with the thatch falling in sparks behind her. And the Earl stood in the orange dark with the rain hissing on the embers, and watched the false Countess kneel in the mud and wipe the soot from a sobbing boy's face, the tenant's child, not her own, and speak to him, too low for any but the child to hear, until the crying stopped, and he heard himself say, before he had decided to speak, "You should not have run into a burning building." She looked up at him through the smoke. "Someone had to." "My lord," she said, and there was no defiance in it, only fact, and the Earl found he had nothing to answer. That was the night, the thing between them, which neither would have named, first became a weight in the air. They breathed, walking back across the dark fields, neither speaking, their lanterns making 2 small moving coins of light in the great wet blackness. Rosamond was aware of him beside her, as she had not let herself be aware of anyone since the road. He offered her his good arm at the stile. She did not take it, because she could not afford to, and they both knew why she could not, and the not-taking sat between them more heavily than any touch could have. The dowager in her dower house across the park was not idle either. She had built this lie, and she did not intend to see it pulled down by the very nephew it was meant to protect, nor by the cousin it was meant to exclude. When she understood that Alaric had come home and had not thrown the widow into the road, she sent for Rosamond, and the interview was a study in cold steel. "You will hold your tongue," the dowager said, seated very straight in her chair with her cane across her knees. "You will not unmake what I have made. If that smiling jackal wins, you and your boy go to the jail and I go to my grave with my house in his soft hands. If my nephew acknowledges what I built, you are a countess and your son is an earl. The only road to ruin is the truth. Do you understand me, girl? The only thing that can destroy us now is honesty." Rosamond understood her very well. She understood, too, what the dowager could not see from inside her own cleverness, that the Earl was not a man who could be governed by a convenient lie, that he had come home from a field of 40,000 dead with very little patience left for fictions, and that the campaign the dowager thought she was directing had a commander she had not accounted for. The dismissive word found Rosamond a 3rd time on the worst night of all, and this time it came to her in a constable's flat voice, in the most public room of her own borrowed house. The assize was 3 weeks off. Mr. Ferrers had laid an information before a magistrate, and the magistrate, who dined often at the Ferrers table in the city, had agreed to hear the matter of the suspected fraud. A constable came to Wexcombe with a paper. He stood in the great hall, twisting his hat, and he read out, in a flat, embarrassed voice, that one widow, named Vale, calling herself Countess of Penhallow, the upstart of whom the county had spoken so long, was required to answer to a charge of conspiracy to defraud, and that the male child known as the heir of Wexcombe was to be examined as to his parentage by persons appointed by the court. It was the word examined that broke her, not the jail. The thought of strange men with cold hands and colder questions standing over a child of 2 who had done nothing, who knew nothing, who would not understand why the warm house had turned to ice around him. Rosamond, who had not wept on the road, who had not wept before the dowager, who had not wept at the burning barn, stood in the great hall and put her hand over her mouth and made no sound at all, and that silent breaking was a more terrible thing to see than any cry. The Earl was there. He had come down at the constable's knock. He stood at the foot of his own stairs, and he watched the woman who had governed his house with such fierce competence come apart without a sound over a child who was not even his blood, and the thing he had carried home and shown, no one rose in him at last. Alaric of Penhallow had buried a wife and a small daughter of his own, 8 years gone, a thiever in the spring before the war, and he had gone to the army precisely because his house had become a tomb. And he had spent 8 years and 3 campaigns learning not to feel the particular thing he felt now. Watching a mother break for a child the world said was not hers. He felt it anyway. The war had not cauterized that grief. It had only buried it under others. He crossed the hall. He did not make a speech. He stopped before her, and he said in the low-level voice that the servants had learned meant he would be obeyed. "No one will examine the boy, not while I stand in this house." And then, more quietly, for her alone, "Sit down. You have not eaten today. I have watched." She sat. He had her brought broth and bread with his own order, the same blunt commands he had once given under fire. "Come inside. Sit down. Eat." And Rosamond understood, slowly, through the fog of her terror, that the coldness she had read in him for 2 weeks had never been coldness at all. It had been a man holding very still over a grief, the way a man holds still when a surgeon's probe is in him, because to move is to make it worse. That night she did not sleep, and neither, she would learn, did he. She heard him below in the library long after the house had gone dark, the slow, uneven tread of a man whose shoulder would not let him rest. And once she came to the head of the stairs in her wrapper, and looked down and saw a single candle burning, and his bowed, dark head over a table spread with papers, and she did not go down. Because there are thresholds a woman in her position may not cross, and she went back to her cold room and lay awake until the gray came. What she did not know was what the papers were. The Earl had not been idle in his stillness. From the first day he had set himself, with a soldier's method, to the one campaign that mattered, which was not the saving of the lie but the finding of the truth, because he had understood at once what neither the Dowager nor the Ferrars had grasped, that a fraud could be beaten by a cleverer fraud only until a cleverer lawyer came along, but that the truth once found and proven could not be beaten at all, and the truth he had begun to suspect was uglier and better than anyone in the county knew. He had written in his halting recovered hand to a man he had served with, a captain of dragoons named Sir Marcus Holt, who had been at Quatre Bras and at Waterloo both, and who now sat as a magistrate 2 counties off, a man Crispin Ferrars did not dine with and could not buy. He had asked Sir Marcus a single question, and he had sent his own man, old Hester's grandson, a quiet groom named Jem, not to the distant parish where the false register lay, but to the carrier whom Ferrars thought he had paid out of the county, with money enough to bring the man back, and a soldier's promise of protection that the carrier, having once served himself, believed. The campaign came to its crisis at the assize. The grey stone town hall of the county seat, 3 weeks after the constable's paper, before the magistrate who dined at the Ferrars table and a gallery packed with every gentle family for 20 miles, come to see the upstart widow brought low. Rosamond stood in the dock in her plain grey gown, with her hands folded and her chin level, and she had told the Earl the night before that she would not let them bring the boy, that whatever was decided about her she would go quietly, if only the child were left in peace, and the Earl had looked at her a long moment and said, "Trust me 1 day more." And she had found, to her own astonishment, that she did. Mr. Crispin Ferrars opened his case with the silken confidence of a man who has bought every card in the deck. He produced his antiquary, who swore the marriage ink was not 2 years old. He produced the sworn statement of the carrier, read aloud since the carrier himself, he said, had left the county. He named the woman in the dock, the upstart, and the adventuress and the kitchen-bred fraud for the last time, in the most public arena the county possessed, the very hall where the hierarchy rendered its verdicts, and Miss Ferrars, in the front row in sapphire silk, permitted herself the smallest of smiles, because the great house was as good as hers. Then the Earl of Penhallow rose, and asked the court's leave to be heard, and the hall went silent, because a dead man come home is a thing that quiets a room. He did not match cruelty with cruelty. He did not make a speech. He did what a careful officer does. He turned the enemy's own ground against him, 1 step at a time. He called, first, the carrier, who was not gone out of the county at all, but sitting in the back of the hall in his Sunday coat, and who swore that Mr. Boldy, Ferrers' agent had paid him 10 guineas to leave and say nothing, and that he had taken the money and stayed, because the new earl had asked him plainly to tell the truth and had reminded him that he too had once worn the king's coat. The antiquary's hired statement, built on that man's purchased absence, fell to pieces in the space of 3 questions. He called. Second, a letter, read into the record by Sir Marcus Holt himself, who had ridden 2 counties to sit on the bench beside the Ferrers' tame magistrate, and could not be waved aside. The letter was from the surgeon of the Belgian farmhouse, and had fixed the earl alive and insensible with fever, on the very week that Mr. Ferrers' first witness had sworn to seeing him dead at Quatre Bras. The whole edifice of the presumed death on which the cousin had built 3 years of patient fraud came down in a single page, and the gallery began, very quietly, to murmur. And then the earl turned to the matter of the marriage, and the whole gallery seemed to hold its breath, for this was the stone the whole arch rested on. He acknowledged in his level voice that the marriage register in the distant parish was indeed less than 2 years old. He acknowledged that she had not been his wife when she came to Wexcombe. He let that truth land in the silent hall, and watched Crispin Ferrers begin, too soon, to smile. "I have not finished," the earl said. He turned to the dock. He had asked Sir Marcus, weeks before, the single question on which everything turned, and Sir Marcus had ridden across 2 counties to answer it in person, and the answer was a small and human and unbreakable fact that no lawyer could buy and no antiquary could date. The quartermaster's clerk named Vale, the widow's husband, dead of fever at Badajoz, had served in Sir Marcus Holt's own brigade, and Sir Marcus had signed the man's papers, and had stood, as it happened, godfather by proxy to the child christened in the regimental chapel, and held in his strong-box these 3 years. The baptismal line that named the boy plainly son of the late Sergeant Vale and his lawful wife, a free-born child of an honest soldier, kin to no earl living or dead, and therefore no fraud upon any estate, because no one in that hall, the earl said, his grey eyes moving once across the gallery and coming to rest on the cousin, had ever asked the woman the simplest question of all, which was whether she had ever, once, in her own voice, claimed the child was his. She had not. The dowager had claimed it. The county had claimed it. The Ferrers had built 3 years of fraud upon a thing the accused widow had never said. And the boy stood safe and unexamined under the protection of a captain of dragoons, and a baptismal line older than the lie, and the charge of conspiracy, which required that she have conspired, fell apart upon the plain fact that she had never spoken the lie at all. Mr. Ferrers came to his feet. His soft hands had begun to shake. He named the earl's evidence a trick, the carrier a bought liar, the surgeon's letter a forgery, and the magistrate, his own tame magistrate, looked at Sir Marcus Holt beside him and at the muttering gallery before him, and did not, this once, dare to agree. The smooth man's polished sentences began to fragment. He said the word upstart once more, and it fell into the silence and died there, because the whole room had turned in the space of an hour from the verdict it had carried in, and no one in that hall would call her that name again. The earl let him finish. Then he said, the only thing he said that day that was not a question or a fact, and he said it quietly, in the same arena where the hierarchy had 3 times rendered its verdict against her, and it was 12 words and no more. She wronged no man. I will wed her. Let the court record it. The hall did not erupt. It exhaled. Drusilla's smile went out like a snuffed candle, and the woman in the dock heard the Earl of Penhallow speak her given name aloud for the first time, not the widow, not the upstart, but Rosamond, plainly as a man names what he means to keep, and she put her hand over her mouth again, but this time it was not to hold in grief. The ride back to Wexcombe was very quiet. The Earl had given her his arm coming down the town hall steps, in front of the whole staring county, and this time because she could at last afford to, she had taken it. In the carriage he sat across from her with his broken shoulder held stiff, and his hat in his good hand. And for a long while neither spoke, and the winter fields went by, bray, and the rooks rose from the bare trees, and at last he said, looking out at the land that was his, I should tell you that I did not do it for the look of the thing. The court is satisfied. I am not a man who needs to satisfy a court." "I know," she said. "You ran into a burning barn for a tenant's child," he said. "You fed my people out of your widow's pension and let the county call you a thief for it. You broke in my hall over a boy not your blood, and would have gone to jail before you let them frighten him." He was quiet a moment. "My house was a tomb when I left it," he said. "Lower. I find it is not one now. I do not know how to thank a woman for that. I know only how to ask her to stay." Rosamond looked at him across the swaying carriage, at the scar through his brow and the gray eyes that had watched her for weeks, and had never, she understood now, been cold at all, and she found that the careful walls of 2 years of survival which the road had built and the dowager had reinforced and the assize had nearly thrown down, and came quietly to rest. "I am not a great lady," she said. "I will shame you, my lord. I do not know the half of what a countess must know." "You governed Wexcombe better dead than my blood governed it living," he said. And there was, at the very corner of his ruined mouth, the smallest movement, very late, that on another man would have been a smile. "I will risk the shame." They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small gray church on the estate, with old Hester weeping in a front pew and the tenants crowded at the back and the boy, scrubbed and solemn in a new coat, holding tight to the nurse's hand and understanding nothing except that the cold had gone out of the great house, and the lady who was his mother smiled now without first gathering herself at the foot of the stairs. The dowager came to the wedding. She came in her best black, leaning on her cane, and she sat very straight and watched the nephew she had given up for dead marry the widow she had used as a tool. And when it was done, she took Rosamond's hand in her own cold one in the church porch, and held it a moment longer than civility required.
"I built you to be a lie,"
she said low, so that none but Rosamond heard. "I find I have built a countess instead. It seems I was wrong about the only thing I was ever certain of, which is what I am owed and what others are." She did not weep, for she was not a woman who wept, but her hand trembled in Rosamond's, and that was a great deal from her, and Rosamond pressed it and let her keep what dignity she had, because mercy, she had learned, was a higher thing than rank, and the old woman had her own long winter still to cross. Mr. Reed Ferrars left the county within the month, and was not heard of again at Wexcombe, his 3 years of patient fraud dissolved in an afternoon, displaced not by a crueler man, but by a better cause. The smiling jackal sent off without a wound he could nurse into a grievance, corrected rather than destroyed, which is all the audience of such a story is ever owed, and all that the just slow world of this place permits. His sister married a baronet in another county before the year was out, and took with her the cold ambition that had selected Wexcombe, and was glad, at the last, to be quit of a house that had refused her. If their story has stayed with you this far, perhaps you will carry one quiet image of it away, the one Rosamond herself kept. It was a small thing, and it came on an ordinary evening the following winter. The great house was warm. The fires were lit along the gallery, and the candles and the leather book spines in the library glowed amber in the low light. The Earl sat in the chair by the hearth where he had once questioned her like a prisoner, and his writing hand had healed enough that he could hold a book again, though his shoulder still pulled in the cold, and always would. Rosamond came in from the nursery with the household ledger under her arm, her figures still as honest to the farthing as they had ever been. And on the small table by the window, where it had sat since the first frost-bound morning he came home, was the child's shoe, outgrown now, kept for no reason either of them could name. She had set it down upon the ledger that first day to steady her hands. He had seen it there, the small worn shoe beside the neat accounts, and had understood, before he understood anything else about her, the whole truth of the woman he would marry, that she carried the child and the labor both, and set them side by side, and asked the world for nothing it had not first taken from her. Rosamond crossed the warm room and stood beside his chair, and the Earl reached up with his good hand and took hers, and neither of them spoke, because the house was quiet, and the boy was asleep, and there was no longer anything that needed saying. Outside, the first snow of the new year began to come down over Wexcombe, soft and slow against the dark glass, settling on the bare limes of the long avenue where a stranger in a faded coat had once stood at the gate of a house that buried him, and had come up the drive, and had found against every word the county swore to, that the dead were not all dead. And the Manor was not a tomb, and the woman the world had named a fraud was the truest thing the old grey house had held in a generation. The shoe sat on the ledger in the candlelight. The snow came down. He did not let go of her hand, and she did not want him to, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough.